Well, I want to welcome everybody to the Maternal and Child Health Student Association seminar tonight. Tonight, we are very excited to present Pregnant on the Run, Caring for Vulnerable Populations During the 2015 to 2018 Refugee Influx in Germany. We are very interested in having our speaker, Jana Pickette, with us from Jacksonville State University. She's the project coordinator of the Office on Violence Against Women. And one of our MCHSA members put us in touch with her to provide this information to you all this evening. And so without much ado, I want to turn it over to Jana and welcome you all to the seminar.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for logging on and listening to me tonight. So I kind of wanted to give everyone an option of how we wanted to do this. So first, I'm going to give you a brief overview of what we want to talk about today. So I will give a bit of an introduction of how I came into this work. Then I'll give a brief history of specifically the refugee situation in Germany in that time frame in which I worked there. Then we talk a little bit about the minimum standards that nonprofits and the UN came up with during that time, and a little bit about the specific situation and the obstacles in providing appropriate care for pregnant refugees in Germany during that time frame. And we always have time to ask questions in the end. But I also kind of wanted to give you a little bit of an option because I can only assume that a lot of y'all have been busy with classes and work today. So I wanted to take a vote in the chat. For those of you who would like it a little bit more interactive and would like for me to ask questions throughout the presentation, just put one in the chat. And if I get a couple of those, we can just go ahead and do that and everyone else can just ride along. If you're genuinely interested in the refugee situation in Germany and you have some more questions, maybe that are even a bit off topic and want to have more time at the end to ask those questions, press 2 in the chat and we'll do that. And if you kind of just want to listen and have just a little bit of time in the end for questions, press 3 and I will just keep on trucking. So I'll give you about 10 seconds to make your choice, and we monitor the chat, and then we'll see what y'all want to do. Okay, it looks like we have mostly 3 and a few 1s, so I might ask a few questions for those eager to participate, and we can kind of go from there. But participation is always voluntary, and a word of warning, I mean, you are kind of like in the field, so you probably know, but some of the content might be a bit difficult. I was trying not to make it too graphic, but if you'll have specific questions about that, I will answer them as honestly as I possibly can. So take care of yourself. I will not be offended if you need to step away, take a sip, drink of water, log off, do whatever you'll need to do to take care of yourself. All right. Thank you so much again for being here. And I will start by saying kind of the gist of it. So taking care of vulnerable populations in any kind of institutions needs gradual, constant effort. It also needs a dialectical relationship between theory and practice. Like we cannot just apply theory to the practice, but we cannot just remain in the constant chaos of the practice, especially if the practice looks like a refugee camp. And we dig a little bit deeper in this in a little bit. And so my advice is to build systems. And I just want y'all to kind of keep that in mind as we're going through this, because I'm describing a very chaotic situation, it can get a little bit overwhelming to talk about it. So just keep in mind these kind of 3 overarching themes as an orientation point. Okay, so who am I? I'm Jana Pickette. I was an exchange student in Mississippi when I was 16, and I then came back to college to Mississippi and got a bachelor's in cultural studies from Millsaps College. I then did a traineeship with the German Academic Exchange Service, which some of you may or may not have heard of, in the field of development cooperation back in Germany. They give out really generous scholarships to international scholars all over the world to get their master's or PhD in Germany. I then accepted a job offer at the Leadership Center in Honduras, where we wrote a curriculum and offered education beyond high school for underserved women in Honduras, with the goal for them to learn English and start their own business later. I did that for about a year when I decided I needed to go back to school and get my master's. And that is when I enrolled in the Jana program, which is the Erasmus Mundus Master Program in Women and Gender Studies. And the way that these programs work is you pick a field of study, and then there's a consortium of universities that with proven excellence in these studies, and you pick a home university and a mobility university. And I promise this becomes relevant really soon. So I had my home university as Granada in Spain, and my mobility university was Central European University in Budapest, Hungary. So this is personal history. Now, how does this relate to the overall history of the world when it comes to refugees? So if y'all remember, in 2011, the Arab Spring protests broke out all over the Arabic world, including Syria. After failed peace talks, the UN officially declared Syria to be in a state of civil war in 2012. A lot of people during this whole refugee situation in Europe always brought up the question, Americans bring up the question a lot, why people didn't go to other Arabic nations. And I just want to point out that they did. Hundreds of thousands at that point in 2012 got on their way of being first internally displaced. So they went to places in Syria where there was not an open conflict and tried to get out of the war zone there. But there also was an increasing number of externally misplaced people, and they would mainly go to Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. By 2013, that number grew to 6.5 internally displaced Syrians and 3 million of them that were displaced outside of their home country. 800,000 of those were in Turkey, and that number will become relevant really soon. In 2014, refugees tried to cross into Europe increasingly, and the Turkish government under the leadership of Erdogan became increasingly more frustrated with the European Union for always claiming to be for human rights and refugees, but not really doing much to help Turkey with the refugee situation. And the relationship between the EU and Erdogan was kind of strained and beginning to be more strained at the time anyways. So Erdogan kind of changed some procedures around this, and that enabled refugees in Turkey to move on into Europe. Now, the problem with this was that Europe had passed a convenient law called the Dublin Procedure. And the Dublin Procedure means that refugees have to stay and go through the entire process of their asylum in the country in which they first landed in the EU. Now, if some of y'all now think, but does that mean that Germany never has to take in any refugees? Well, that's exactly right, because Germany sets that center in Europe, right? So by the grace of its geography and by European law, Germany is actually in a situation where, according to the Dublin Procedure, they never have to take any asylum seekers. And other European countries thought that it was unfair and a little bit too convenient, and I kind of must agree with that on a personal note. So there was a lot of like inner European and out of European conflict at that time, when in 2015, that kind of conflict came to a head when Chancellor Angela Merkel at the time decided to suspend the Dublin Agreement and open the borders to Germany, which is where the refugees wanted to go in the first place. So, and this is kind of showing you a little bit what the situation was. And I think these maps make it a bit clear. So you see here Syria, and you have like Lebanon, Iraq, and the other Arab world, and Tunisia here, where they would go to first, and Turkey, so the neighboring countries. as you saw from the other slide, in 2014, 2015, the situation in Iraq also became increasingly more difficult, meaning that refugees from Iraq would pour into Syria and the already stretched thin areas where war wasn't reached. And from there, they would truck on to Turkey. A lot of Syrians at that time had lived in Turkey for years and now increasingly decided to take the more risky but direct route over the Mediterranean into Greece, and then up to Hungary, Hungary being the first country on that route that is in the European Union. There's also a longer route, more expensive, but arguably safer, through Turkey and Greece here, but then the two routes would meet and everyone would kind of get stuck in Budapest. So if you'll now, you paid attention to my personal timeline, in the winter of 2014, 2015, I was in Budapest getting my master's degree in women's and gender studies. And the picture that you're seeing right here is Keleti Pályaudvar. That is my commute to university. That was the train station that I walked through every day. And what you see here are the improvised refugee camps of people trying to get on the train, because Keleti station was the station that had the trains that would run directly to Munich. The Hungarian government at the time would sometimes forcefully prevent people from getting on those trains to go to Munich. And the scenes became increasingly more dire and increasingly more brutal. So by the time that I was due to graduate, this is what that looked like in Keleti station every day. So then Angela Merkel decided to open the borders for humanitarian reasons. And by the beginning of September, people were able to get on the trains and go to Munich and were distributed from there to different parts of Germany, most of which in my state, because they used a kind of distribution system that took into account the amount of people, the population of the state. So the bigger the population of the state, the more refugees people got. My state is North Rhine-Westphalia, the state with the biggest GDP, almost second biggest GDP in inner Germany, and the largest population, so we got the most refugees. Almost 900,000 refugees entered Germany in that year. And you can see from that, not all of that doesn't mean that all of them stayed or all of them got any kind of refugee status, but it was a huge influx that Germany was not prepared to handle. So this is, to the left, is the refugee camp I started working on in right after I graduated with my master's. We actually renovated and built all of this. So what you see on the left here, does anyone know what that is? Any guesses what that used to be? It's kind of interesting for Americans to be confronted with what that is. So what you're seeing here is like military barracks, housing for animals. Well, so someone in the chat says housing for animals. Well, no, those were old military barracks from the British occupation of Germany. And the British occupation of Germany after World War II actually lasted until a few years before the refugees influx started in Germany. So those were just kind of abandoned buildings, and the German government put a lot of money in it to renovate it, but we were in there painting, building up furniture, getting it ready. And what you see here, that big hall, that huge building, that is where they used to repair immensely big military trucks. And on the right side here, you can see the inside of what that hall looked like. So you can see like the really high ceilings. Here you can see like those really big gates. This thing was impossible to keep warm in winter. And this is when we started. And we put up these kind of room dividers, but you can see they didn't really go to the ceiling, and those were the beds. This is where we would put single men. So with the idea in mind of vulnerable populations, what are some advantages and disadvantages of a place like this when it comes to housing vulnerable populations? And I'm giving you about the people who did want to participate, I'm giving you about 15, 20 seconds to maybe come up with some ideas.
It can impact mental health.
Okay,
How
so?
I think the enclosure, the space, it can feel very like secluded. Even the colors can be very depressing, being just away from what like their normal way of life. This could be a very traumatic experience. So I feel like mental health would be one for sure.
Definitely. And it's also like good to remember that the people who came in that first wave, those were the people who could afford that travel first, meaning that those were like the doctors and the engineers and like the elite of the country. And then they lived in places like this and houses like this that were all kind of like the same. And I mean, they were buildings for soldiers. Now, the advantage of this is, and I do get what you're saying with the color scheme. Like I really wanted to color code all the buildings to make orientation easier and to make it a little bit more friendly looking. I know it's kind of like putting lipstick on a pig, but it's just to kind of orientate, like this disorientation is a big obstacle to mental health there. So our offices were there, the government office was there, and we had like a nurse practitioner. They are not really a doctor's office, but we had some nurses there and a kindergarten. And people would usually stay in this place anywhere from 3 months to almost a year. Because we have like these different tiers of refugee camps. And while in the first, what we call the first wave of refugees, we had primarily young refugee Syrian men. We also had like a lot of families coming in like the second wave. So the advantage of this was that we had these different houses where we could designate them to families, single women, single men. So they would be kind of separated, and everyone, and the other advantage of this was that if you can see here, I mean, they look depressing, but they have windows all the way through. And one of the biggest obstacles to making refugee camps nice is like fire prevention. Like the fire department is like the strictest agency to deal with. So refugees in other camps that I worked at weren't able to lock their doors, which is a problem for me if I want to do risk reduction and have difficulties with harassment. But here they could lock their doors because they could climb out the window if need be in case a fire broke out. So like, while this all looks dire, there are always like ways to look at it and analyze it and find out how to make the best out of a bad situation. This is another refugee camp. This was also like a second tier. So again, like people would, after they first came to Germany and went through like the first kind of camp, they would go through the second accommodation and wait for basically the decision and go through the process of applying for asylum. This used to be an old hospital. So on the right side here, let's see if I can move my face a little bit, was the third refugee camp that I worked on, all under the same project. So this is also an old military barrack that was originally built in World War II. So it was like Nazi occupied. Then the Americans were there for a little bit, and then the Canadians had it until it kind of fell into a state of disrepair. Oops, I'm so sorry. So most of it was still just not renovated. So refugees would only stay like in this part. And there was a cafeteria here. Looking at German pictures always makes me switch into German in my head. So I'm just kind of stumbling. And there was a little house here that was renovated that I then ran, that was only for, first of all, it was only for pregnant women. And then I extended it a little bit to take in other like traumatized single women, which really meant that I accepted all single traveling refugee women into that space just to make sure they are kept safe. So you see like all these different things. So they basically, what Germany did was they just took buildings that were not in use anymore, renovated them, and put refugees in it. And depending on what those buildings look like, we had to do the best we could with keeping people safe. So when that all started, we didn't really have a lot to work with when it came to minimum standards and risk analysis. So what you have in front of you are still the minimum standards today, but that was all that I had to deal with or that I could rely on when it came to designing something, because like my job then as women's commissioner was specifically to keep those minimum standards, write a risk analysis, and make recommendations and programs to keep people safe, especially pregnant refugee women, but also other vulnerable populations. So the first kind of pillar of this was personnel and personnel management. So that goes from hiring, which as much as I wanted to and wrote up policies and procedures for that, at that point, Germany kind of took every one who walked into the camp, because we just needed people. By the government standard, we were like contractors for the government. We're like a nonprofit, essentially contracting for the government. And there were certain kind of people who had to be in the accommodation at all times. So we had a lot of people leaving, a lot of people coming and going. So we kind of took everyone, especially if they could speak a language that we desperately needed. So while that is a good idea in theory, it didn't really work out for me in practice. A code of conduct is kind of like the same. I wrote a beautiful code of conduct for all of these things, but with all these people coming and going, it was difficult to hold them accountable, because ultimately the interests of my organization as the contractor and the interest of the government kind of clashed with my interest of keeping people safe. It's not that they didn't overlap at any time. It's just like that wasn't a priority at that time. So what I could do was train personnel and do awareness training and workshops. And we dive a bit deeper into this in a little bit. Then the internal structures and external cooperations. Building structures is the most important thing, especially flexible structures that I kind of walk that fine line between like being steady enough to hold up to that pressure, but also being flexible enough, because sometimes we had 0 people in the camps, sometimes we had 1,000, and this could change within a few days. So these like huge influxes of people, not only in Germany itself, but in the camps specifically, made caring for everyone consistently very difficult. And then like prevention and risk management, one of my favorites. So again, any kind of SOPs, standard operating procedures, danger assessment when there was a difficult situation, debrief later. These kind of things are incredibly important in any kind of work, but specifically when you work in refugee camps, and just writing it all down. And then the holding people accountable was more difficult, though we did definitely have situations where people needed to debrief later on and wanted to do better. The only consistent in all of this is really how inconsistent everything was. Sometimes everything would work wonderfully and it depended on the people, and my colleagues were great. And sometimes you would just have a crew or shift that was terrible to work with. Sometimes you got police officers that came that were terrible to work with. Sometimes the government agent that was responsible for you was wonderful. Sometimes they were terrible, and that could really make your life miserable and either really help you with all of these things that you're supposed to do or completely derail them. Humane, protective, and enabling conditions. So the government, while we were running the camps, the government was responsible for keeping them in these humane conditions. So everything that we wanted to change, from like painting to to fire extinguishers, to putting furniture in, the government had to approve, and the fire department. So this was, again, sometimes it wasn't a problem, sometimes it was, and having these child-friendly spaces. And I know there was like a big to-do about putting rugs in that house that I was running, because that was a fire issue. And then like what you said earlier about having these spaces that look, that really don't look welcoming and nice, it can really do a number on your mental health. But if you have 500 people living in a space, one fire could theoretically be a huge danger to all of them. So it's like weighing these risks. And then also remember that it was in Germany, so they were just a little bit extra when it came to things like that. So and then monitoring and evaluating the protection plan. So again, like data collection was extremely difficult and extremely important, because if you do not collect the data, that is, I mean, but how are you going to collect the data? So this is one of the questions to you now. So you have a group of maybe 20 women. They all speak different languages, and about half of them don't know how to read or write. How do you do participatory monitoring and data collection? How do you get feedback? Okay, because it's a problem, right? It's like if no one says, it's not, let's see if someone, isn't it just images? Yes, exactly. So it's not perfect, and it wouldn't hold up to any kind of research standard necessarily. But I would use images like of smiley faces, and you still have to take into consideration that honest feedback is kind of hard to come by. Of course, you can work with translators and you can work with your colleagues, and you can try to build these relationships, which sometimes works if people are on your camp longer. But if they're only there for a week and you wanted to know if a workshop was helpful to them, or if like their access to healthcare was adequate, I just keep it real simple and have like the smiley faces, and they can like check it or not, but they still have to kind of see that they still have to have this trust in you that they're not going to be negative consequences, and they have to understand what it's for. And that's sometimes a very foreign and difficult concept. The gist of this, of these minimum standards is too, that every single institution and every single accommodation has to do a risk analysis for those minimum standards. As you could see in the earlier slides, if I can go back, and my computer might not let me, but you could see like how vastly different these accommodations look and these camps look, and how different they are when it comes to the laws of the government that they're under, depending on what tier of immigration and what tier in the asylum process they're in. So all of this goes into effect. So you have to basically take these as these standpoints and then go into your institution and in your building and just look, okay, where are the structures? Where do you need to put lights? Who gets to have a key for their room? Who can't have a key? Where do you put the Syrians? Can you group women from different linguistic groups together? It's like all of these things need to go like into this, and you really need to think it through. And a lot of times you really won't be able to do that unless you are confronted with a case where it's necessary to think about, because like it's just too diverse to do everything. It's why I said it's a gradual process. Okay, so, and because it's such a diverse group of people, I mean, at the end of it, we had like 37 different countries and a larger number of languages represented in the camps that I was working on. So let's just kind of focus what y'all interested in, which is pregnant women. So who are the pregnant people in the camps? So I kind of put them into broad categories before I break down these categories again. So some of them are married women who are traveling with their families. A lot of them already had children. Some of them are married and have other children with them, but their husband got lost somewhere along the way. Sometimes they were able to be reunited later, sometimes not. Some of them are pregnant and single. Some of them are survivors of sexual assault that they experienced on the run. And some of them were survivors of human trafficking. Now, on the surface, those seem to be still pretty diverse, but a lot of times there's this element of coercion in all of these cases. Like, of course, like when it comes to rape and human trafficking and sex work for survival, all of these things are kind of like obvious, but there's also kind of an element where perception creates reality, meaning that a lot of times refugees were under the impression that if one of their children would be born in Germany, that their entire family could get status because their child would have German citizenship, which is not true. That is a thing that happens in the United States, but it's not a thing that happens in Germany. So even like single women would sometimes like seek out German fathers, which is, and that is a better strategy, because like if the father then like claims the child and like acknowledges the child and has a right to see the child, then the woman might be able to stay and get like a status that way. But just because a child was born in Germany, they usually have the nationality of the mother, because paternity is harder to establish than maternity. That's just kind of like very briefly. If you have questions about this later, we can get into the nitty-gritty of it. So what are some of the challenges that pregnant refugees have? Well, they're just a high-risk group for a reason. There is no proper pregnancy care. While pregnancy care in Germany is generally excellent, they are moved around too much to have consistent care. And as y'all all know, like it's not just like having access to doctors and midwives, it's also being able to have a home environment that is stress-free and steady, with access to good nutrition. And as you can imagine, that is just not a thing that happens. No proper data collection. It is of vital importance to know when your due date is, at least like somewhat. And we have something called the Mutterpass. They have been filled out wrong so many times. I've never seen one of those during my time working with refugees that has been filled out correctly. The due dates were always wrong, which caused huge issues in the care of refugees, because then doctors would claim that refugees would be over their due date, or the child would be too small or would measure too small, when that really wasn't the case, because they were like so focused on the data, because that's usually not a problem in Germany. The data that is recorded is usually correct, but that wasn't the case here, hardly ever. And I knew that for a fact because I worked in different refugee camps and different tiers. So sometimes the refugees that I would see in a tier 1 refugee camp, I would see again in the tier 2 refugee camp. And then like by that time, something had happened and the data was off. So we got, as a consequence, a lot of high-risk pregnancies. Pregnant women also didn't get any extra money. So refugees in Germany get a certain kind of allowance from the state monthly. But as you know, as a pregnant woman, you sometimes you need more vitamins, you need to buy stuff in anticipation of your baby, you just need certain things extra, and there was just no extra money for it. Then there's just a lack of education, for lack of a better term. So it's, I mean, being pregnant is overwhelming anyways. Being pregnant in a country whose language you don't understand and whose system you don't understand, and that is extremely bureaucratic, is overwhelming. So even really educated refugees could not really navigate that system. And then add trauma to this, and you cannot really function. So trauma sometimes makes you like downright like act, again, for lack of a better term, act kind of like dumb, like you're like in a fog. It's like you have depression and then some. You cannot function like you normally would. And then with all these other things added together, you can't really navigate all of this. And stillbirth, as a consequence of this, we had some stillbirths that we dealt with. Abortion access, again, it was just a challenge, because the system wasn't really set up for it, although abortion is decriminalized in Germany. I'll talk about this in a second a little bit more. And access and education to birth control. So again, like German government would not pay for birth control, so women would get pregnant while in refugee camps, and even if they knew how to prevent pregnancy or were previously able to do so, but some of them were also like illiterate and had a very low educational standard, and they were just kind of, they just didn't know how to prevent it at all. So you had like this huge diversity of educational backgrounds. So whenever you offered workshops, you had to be really careful not to be condescending, because like they were literally like midwives and doctors among the pregnant refugees who really did know better, but were just not in a position where they could prevent pregnancy at that point, or might have been coerced by their partner. Or I've never really heard of them like wanting to be pregnant at that point, but they also like already had other kids and wanted to continue with their family. So those were all issues. So again, I kind of wanted to give y'all some practical cases, and I wrote down a bunch, and I'm not sure if we have to go through all of them, but this is just to give you an idea that once you're confronted with these cases, you can kind of go back to these minimum standards and see how they match up. And then you go back to what kind of environment you work in and see how that kind of all goes together, doing the best you can. So the first case I kind of wanted to talk about was HIV. I had one pregnant woman from Nigeria who was HIV positive, did not have AIDS yet, but so luckily she was in the refugee camp in Münster that was 5 minutes away from a big university hospital, and they had a lot of access to that medication, to that treatment in walking distance. So then you kind of have to go through, okay, what kind of training does the personnel need? Because even so, we like to think of ourselves as very enlightened and not discriminatory in Germany. When it comes to HIV, which we're not really used to, we don't really have a huge HIV rate in Germany at all anymore. This typical kind of discrimination or fear of it can bubble up. So it was really important to train not only the personnel on that the person was taking medication for it and how to take the medication in case they had any questions, but also like kind of say like, okay, you're safe, you can touch their baby, you can touch her, if she falls, you can help her. Just these kind of things, like that this is not how HIV is transmitted. And it also kind of led to a policy where it was kind of a need to know basis, because not everyone was really able to deal with this private information appropriately. So then also lucky, because Münster is not only as a university hospital, it's also a university town and a very well-off town. And they had an organization specifically for HIV and AIDS. And I connected that refugee in question with that organization. And they did a lot of one-on-one work, a lot of help, raised a lot of money for like baby clothes and strollers and things like that. And that was extremely helpful. And then, but then of course, like if you have a baby and if you're sick or trying to prevent being sick, like sanitary conditions are really important. A private room to keep this private, to keep this health condition private, is really important. So I was able to provide that in this case because, as I mentioned before, there was like this small house that had about 10 private rooms that I could give to individual women and their children. So, but oftentimes we could just kind of zone in on the problem, right? So we just kind of, okay, this is the HIV person, so we do everything HIV. But that person also happened to be like a ferocious reader, and she really loved nonfiction books. And this is also a way how to stabilize people and how to let them know that they're more than a diagnosis and they're more than just like the words that describe them in the system. So I was trying to make sure that they got nonfiction books to read that they liked, and also hook them up with some ideas of where they could continue their education depending on where they would land in Germany, because they weren't like at their final destination yet. So I couldn't directly connect them with educational services, but I could give them at least an idea of what is possible and where they could start. Okay, case 2, high-risk pregnancies. All of my pregnancies there, which were about dealt with about almost 50 pregnant women, but some of them were like there for a few hours and some of them were there for the almost entirety of their pregnancy. Almost all of them ended up being high risk because of all these risk factors I talked about before. It really just makes a huge difference in the life of a pregnant person. So like, and there's some things that every pregnant person needs. So access to high quality healthcare. We could usually manage that. It was easier when it was closer to the city. In rural settings, it was a bit trickier. But it also means that we had a good relationship with the government, because while this kind of standard pregnancy care was fine, when it came to like these high risk assessments or counseling, that was the kind of thing that was still medical treatment, but the government had to sign off on it and spend extra money on it, which is also something that Germans are not really used to, because we spend money on our health insurance like every month, and then we just go to the doctor and everything is paid for. But with refugees, they didn't really have their little card yet, so everything still had to be processed one by one, case by case in the medical system through the government. We also installed an emergency button for these high-risk pregnancies, like in that little house. That wasn't possible in the other refugee camps I worked with, but we were able to do that then, because we had like a partner with these, these kind of like buttons that you press when you fall and can't get up, that one. So, and then we, again, like it went to training, what happens if at night, like the button is pressed, the alarm is sounded, how does the personnel need to react, because I'm not there 24/7. And again, workshops on healthy pregnancy and birth control, always keeping in mind who your audience is, so you don't accidentally educate the Syrian gynecologist on her own pregnancy. So one-on-one check-ins and care is really important, and building these relationships, because you don't really know what those people need if you don't build a relationship with them. And that's sometimes easier and sometimes harder depending on language barriers. Midwife care is also, I know that's not as common in the States, but it's more common in certain areas in Germany. It's really common in the UK. And this is really helpful because getting people to their appointments was a challenge and oftentimes took all day, while midwives were able to come into these spaces and see people where they were at. And that was really helpful in making it accessible and getting a lot of their prenatal and prenatal checkups done. They would still go to the doctor, but the midwife was able to be like a support and just keep things in check and really support us in that. So case 3, and that might be the last case. So I want to have like some time for questions if y'all have any. I feel like it would be really difficult to gain clear informed consent when it comes to participation in studies. Yes, that is exactly right. And that's why I didn't really call them studies. It's more like feedback for my own use. I still like use the data like internally, but it wouldn't be something that would be publishable. But it's still important to make it as participatory as possible, because we kind of want to follow this thing like nothing about us without us, and you like with this case. So then I had like a pregnant minor, and we didn't really know who the father was at first. It turned out the father was 18, but but I had another case where it was more like a much older father, so there was kind of this more like child trafficking situation happening. So as you can see, like again, like access to high quality care, workshops, the baby box, pregnancy counseling, these were kind of like those foundation pillars that just came up over and over again, and we were able to develop like a system, like a foundation that everyone get. But now we had a problem, because like this pregnant minor had like no parental units and no family, and in Germany you're not just allowed to keep your baby as a minor. So that kind of, at that point, we had to call the German version of DHR or CPS and just kind of like deal with them. And their first instinct was to take the baby away, but we were able to work with them, again, building those relationships, and got her into like a facility where minors could kind of live and gain independence. And like the 18-year-old father had like rights and things like that. So this kind of gets into the nitty-gritty of like where the bureaucracy crashes with like the care that you can provide, and because you want to do what the pregnant person wants you to do, but they're also like laws that you cannot ignore, but you have to kind of advocate for it and see what is possible. I'm sure that's the same. And I'm not sure if y'all had I had some more things, like we had some pregnancy losses, and that was difficult because they were at like 3 and they were all really late losses, and the one woman got transferred against my wishes right after she found out that her pregnancy was not viable. So I have no idea what happened there, and it really bothers me. Again, and this is like how these kind of the needs of the government to move people along in the system crashes with the needs of the people and my need to keep them safe. So but the one that I did see through, again, like high quality access to medical care, pregnancy counseling, one-on-one, what do you need? And then like in this case, I was also able to access some brief counseling at least 2 times until the person was moved on. And then we had to organize a funeral, which again wasn't covered by the government. So this is kind of getting in this little like heartbreaking and awkward situation, because sometimes it depends on what kind of state or like county government you work under. They might say like, okay, we pay for a small funeral, or they might say like, we don't pay for a funeral at all, and it's just like an anonymous burial, so you don't even know where your baby is buried. So that's all these things are kind of like, you encounter them, you can't really plan ahead of them because it might be different from camp to camp and situation to situation, but you get an idea of how these things work, and then you can write policies for it and make it as easy as possible. However, the laws around it also changed about every 5 minutes, again making it more difficult to give proper care for these people. And
if Jana, if I can interrupt real quick, we did have a question come through the chat box, and this participant asked if you could explain more about how you dealt with human trafficking in the camps.
Oh, absolutely. So again, it's interesting how things kind of came in waves. So like after the Syrians and after the families came, then more and more people came who were actually already in Italy for a long time, and those people were typically human trafficked into Italy at some point. So one of the things that I did is I worked with I built an external relationship with an organization that came into our camps and trained us on how to recognize human trafficking. I also worked with I kind of coached the refugees themselves, that no one has to disclose anything to me, and I don't prod, but I did have a relationship with people who kind of advise them on the asylum process. Well, if you're a victim of human trafficking, that is a reason to get not asylum, because you need to be personally persecuted by your government to get asylum status, but you get a refugee status if you can prove that you're a victim of human trafficking, which is difficult, but these organizations can kind of help you build your case. And it's important you mentioned this during your hearing with the government. So the way that I dealt with that, I just made sure that people coaching them on that knew that this might be the case, so they could kind of coach people on what to say. And then I'm again, like they were still moved on. So like having access to counseling was really difficult. Human trafficking in Europe worked a little bit different. They were typically people from Africa, a lot of times vulnerable women from Africa being trafficked into Italy and then maybe trafficked further or just kind of left there. So I'm not sure if that answers your question or how deep you want to go into this, but these kind of cases become more they were never like the majority, but they became more and more frequent as a lot of these women kind of found out that there were resources for them in Germany, and then they just kind of tried to make the run for Germany because they kind of got the impression that they might be safer there than they would be in Italy. So it works a little bit different here in the States, but the kind of dynamic is still there.
Yes, thank you. I was just wondering, I guess, so in sorry, I'm trying to figure out a way to phrase the question. So in like with your experience in that, was it more likely that people were I don't want to say escaping, but like going to Italy to escape the trafficker, or would they come into the camps with the person that was trafficking them? Like what?
So they were different kind of scenarios, but they were typically one of three. So basically all refugees were part of human trafficking because virtually all of them paid someone to traffic them in one place or another. The kind of trafficking that we typically talk about when we talk about human trafficking is actually more accurately sex trafficking. And sometimes single women would exchange sex work to be able to afford the journey to Europe, which, you know, is still like coercion. Sometimes I had one case of actually like she was like mentally disabled and she was stolen from, she said she went to the market one place and then just some people stole her and sexually abused her significantly, and then trafficked her into Europe to work in the sex trade. So, and then when it was kind of like her debt was, so to speak, like paid off, they always like phrase it that way, like it was like their decision. But when she wasn't useful anymore, they kind of discarded her in Italy, and then she just kind of like wandered, and somehow, and I still don't know exactly how, she made her way to Germany. But I mean, from Italy, it's not that difficult anymore, but it's so there's kind of like, so again, like these are the three, like people paying, oftentimes like in family units, or like people with both. I mean, those are all human traffickers, people who pay with sex work for their journey over to Europe, and people who were kidnapped and sexually abused in the sex trade. So like, and again, the kind of risk factors. So if like in this case, if a single woman from certain countries, like typically Nigeria, but not only Nigeria, just kind of came and said like they lived in Italy for a while, then those are just kind of some red flags that there might be some abuse there. So I would just like offer them to connect them with other resources. And the idea that they would come to the refugee camps with their traffickers is an interesting one. So usually if you cannot prove that you're related, you wouldn't necessarily stand together. So while some of them were afraid that the trafficker would still find them, it was, and like there were other situations where people were trying to find political activists or young women who escaped a particularly bad situation where their family was trying to find them, and actually had government agents from their country trying to come find them in camps. But usually human traffickers they didn't have the resources to come to camps and find them. They may try, but it's difficult because people are just kind of sent in and out randomly.
Thank you for clarifying. I just didn't know if people would, like sex traffickers would see that as an opportunity, I guess.
No, but they definitely do. They see everything as an opportunity. And the thing is just, if we don't keep those vulnerable populations safe in these camps and after, they are just kind of like prime vulnerable to fall victim to sex traffickers again. And this sex trade is completely legal in Germany, but it happens just way too often. Like most of the people working the sex trade are women from different countries. So a lot of them kind of come from these situations where they feel like they don't have access to other jobs. So there is like this huge element of coercion. And if it's women who have already been abused and have this history of abuse, they're definitely more vulnerable to it. So if we do not put in measures to protect them, then this is what they're gonna end up in, very likely. So it's definitely something that I was very conscious about and cautious about, and what the human trafficking organizations that I work with were also really concerned about.
Wow. Okay. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Jana. I know we're a minute past the hour, and I hate to jump in and cut you off, but I appreciate so much you taking the time to be with us this evening. And this topic is very unique and intriguing, and I really was looking forward to your presentation tonight, and I know a lot of other people across campus were too. So thank you for giving us your contact information, so that if people have additional questions, they can get in touch with you. And if you've got any questions about the MCHSA, the Maternal and Child Health Student Association, you're absolutely welcome to go to our Engage page or to email me directly, and I can answer your questions. So thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a good evening.
Thank you again so much for having me. And if y'all have any other follow-up questions, there's my email address. Always willing to talk about these kind of topics.